If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and we're going to spend some time talking about China today for a couple of reasons. First, there's a story here in North Dakota that made national headlines, been making national headlines for well over a year, and it was about the Fufeng. Somebody pronounced it Fufeng the other day, and now I find myself questioning, have I been pronouncing it wrong? I've been saying Fufeng like a true Midwesterner.
Right. That may be it. Yeah,
that may not be right. Whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about. It's the corn milling plant in Grand Forks that has now been canceled because we finally got an answer from the federal government through the Department of the Air Force regarding the potential security threat of that. We talked with Mayor Brandon Bochensky earlier in the week, but now we've got news of a Chinese balloon that's floating over Montana somewhere. That is so big. I mean, they're saying it's like at 45,000 feet, and it could still be visible with the naked eye, which tells me this thing's got to be really, really big. Anyway, here with me to talk about some of that stuff is Senator Kevin Cramer, who was instrumental, along with Senator John Hoeven, in getting us an answer finally on the Fufeng debate. And Kevin, one of the things that frustrated me about this, the first guest I had on, after the news came down from the Air Force was Mayor Bochensky, and I honestly felt really bad for Mayor Bochensky and for a lot of the other local officials who are stuck trying to make decisions about this plant with a variable that they could not possibly answer, which is national security. That was such a terrible place for them to be in. I'm fine. I'm glad they finally have an answer, but I did not envy them being in that position.
Well, I feel badly for them as well, I suppose, but it's a little bit like having to convince them that fire is hot. I mean, in all honesty, I was frustrated that everything I told them a year ago is exactly what the Air Force said a week ago, or less than a week ago. And somehow they kept, I think it's like I always say, 5-year-olds believe in Santa Claus because they should, 10-year-olds believe in Santa Claus because they want to. And for whatever reason, it seemed to me they kept hoping for someone to tell them it was okay to do this. When I think it was pretty intuitive to the vast majority of people in the country, and certainly to the national security hawks and people that care about this sort of thing, that it wasn't okay. And so I think they kept waiting for somebody to tell them it was okay. And of course, no one did. And when the CFIUS process came back with a non-jurisdictional conclusion, which is bad on them, first of all, and really unfortunate, they sort of took that as a green light. At least several of them did. Again, it's sort of like hearing what you want to hear as opposed to what is being said. And I can go back to many points over the course of the last year when the signals could not have been clearer. And probably besides myself being on the Senate Armed Services Committee was when the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a good 8 months ago or more, was asked at an Armed Services Committee hearing if he was concerned about the Fufeng investment in Grand Forks. And his answer was to Senator Tom Cotton, who asked the question, I'd rather discuss that with you in a secure setting. Well, okay.
I don't think you need a secure setting to say, oh, everything's fine.
Everything's good, right?
Let me play devil's advocate on that just a little bit, because I understand your point. I'm always looking at, do we want to create a situation where local officials are making decisions about national security, not just with China, but let's say a Saudi Arabian company, let's say a Brazilian company, a Canadian company. I don't know, any foreign company that's coming in and wants to build a factory or a office building or a facility, and now we have local officials taking it upon themselves to say yay or nay based on national security. I'm uncomfortable with that. I say that this is a bad example of it because I think it was pretty clear-cut. I can understand the reticence, though, of local officials saying, we can't consider that. Like, I don't know that any of them at any point was saying it's okay. It's saying, I think they were kind of saying, well, we have to assume it's okay because we're assuming that if this was bad, the federal government would tell us not to do it. I don't. To me, this is not a local failure. This is a failure of the federal government where we need to. Am I wrong in viewing it that way?
I think you're a little bit wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. The federal government did let them down in many respects. The CFIUS process especially let them down, but that didn't surprise me either. I was not a big fan of it, but once the CFIUS process started, I encouraged them to do it quickly. And knowing, of course, that the CFIUS process is a very closed loop, and we can go into all that if you'd like eventually, but that did sort of stop an answer for a good long time. It prevented the Air Force and the Department of Defense and intelligence agencies from advising. All of that said, what I fear more than what you just described is a federal government that makes all the local decisions for people. And that's way worse in our system, because here's the thing. The Air Force will mitigate any risks that a local government imposes on them or allows on them. Their job is not to mitigate the local government's risk. Their job is to mitigate the national security risk. And they have lots of options to do that with. And I think you and I maybe have talked about this before, but it's not like the Air Force has been crazy about the Grand Forks Air Force Base for a number of years. It's been a base that was greatly diminished after the last BRAC round. It used to have bombers and it used to have fighter jets. It used to have missiles and tankers. And then it got this rather small ISR mission. I, for one, and Senator Hoeven, for another, worked really, really hard to keep that base relevant so that when new next generation ISR missions come along, Grand Forks would be a base that's available. And guess what? That exact thing happened. But it was not the Air Force's first pick. And so when you spend a lot of, your state's political capital on getting a space ground station, the very first and the only Air Force ground station for low Earth orbiting satellite system, launched by SpaceX on behalf of the Space Force, and the next generation of ISR aircraft there. The last thing you want is the community sort of, just sort of ignoring that and going on with this other decision. But even at that, without the community asking, local community folks raised the alarm, and it didn't take long for the pitch to get high, and for what I think for a conclusion that I think was obvious and should have been obvious all along. So yeah, I think the federal government could have been quicker in their answer. But also remember, the Air Force works very hard to be a partner with the local community, to be respectful of the local community.
Yeah, they do that here. I mean, I live just south of an Air Force base, so they do that here.
So yeah, exactly right. You know how important that relationship between Minot and the Minot Chamber and the Friends of the Base, the
Task Force 21.
Task Force 21, they advocate for the missions at the base,
sure,
at the Pentagon, all of those things. So these are really important partnerships. And so I think out of respect as much as anything for the community, they wanted the community to have room to make this decision. Now, before anyone thinks this is like a massive dumping on Grand Forks and that they really, really blew it, I would submit to you, Rob, and maybe this is my glass half full personality, but the city of Grand Forks and this experience, as painful and as long as it was a great gift to the country. There are many of these decisions around the country. No one has sounded the alarm like Grand Forks has. No one's gone through the process like Grand Forks has. And finally, the Air Force came out strongly, unambiguously, to use their own term, about in their opposition to these kinds of investments. And I think that'll provide a lot of clarity for several communities throughout the country.
It seems to me like we need a better process for this, because you're right. I mean, all over the country. And when I was talking with Mayor Bachensky, one thing that we were talking about was the fact that it's in the modern era, there is types of espionage and levels of espionage that just weren't, they weren't possible even 20, 30, 40 years ago. Yeah, and so it's not 1952 anymore, and Japan's trying to build an auto factory, right? I mean, it's 2023, and some of the surveillance stuff is very sophisticated. And I feel like if we're going to have foreign countries investing in our country, which, at face value, I think is a good thing, I feel like we need a process where, as part of the checklist, where a local government could say, hey, federal government, whose job it is to oversee our relationships with other countries, whose national defense is in your purview, what do you say about this, right? And I guess I thought that was CFIUS, but apparently not. I mean, if CFIUS couldn't weigh in on this, what I don't know what their purpose is. So,
Yeah, no,
do we need to craft like a new federal law or something? Like maybe we need to get rid of CFIUS and replace it with something better? I mean, I don't know what the answer is.
Well, we either need to get rid of the CFIUS process or fix it, and probably fix it's going to be the more likely outcome because CFIUS is quite new, as you know. And agriculture has sort of carved out its own lane, as it has in lots of things, because agriculture is, special, and it's certainly special in our part of the world. Growing food is an important, national security issue. Having said that, we've also lived through this pandemic where critical supplies of things like food and pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, have been vulnerable and have been exploited. And China, and Russia, two of the biggest exploiters of critical supply chains, have the upper hand, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's in some cases oil and gas, and in other cases pharmaceuticals, especially in China. And China already owns a good 25% or more of our meat supply, in terms of meat packing and processing. So we really have to be much more careful. And CFIUS is not prohibited from considering agriculture, but it is diminished in terms of agriculture. Now, the proximity to the air base and agriculture became part of the balance. And I think that CFIUS lawyers, that would be the Department of Justice lawyers specifically, concluded that in a very narrow reading of the law and very narrow ruling, and I think somewhat political ruling, decided they didn't have this jurisdiction. But what they didn't decide is that it was a good idea to go forward with this. And so we need to fix CFIUS. And there's legislation. I'm already on some legislation to bring the ag department right into CFIUS to make sure that agricultural investments are part of CFIUS. Because even if there wasn't an air base 12 miles away, I don't think giving or selling more of our food supply chain to China is a good idea.
So how do we handle that with existing? I mean, it's again, I think what you're talking about, reviewing the CFIUS process, I view that as we've got to modernize some of these processes, even though CFIUS is not that old. We got to modernize. Let's say we got to modernize our thinking, right? To embrace modern technology, to embrace modern economies. But what do we do? Because one of the things during the Fufeng debate is everybody always brought up, and it's a relevant point, was that there was already a major Chinese-owned company operating in Grand Forks that operate aircrafts, as a matter of fact, Cirrus aircraft. So, I guess with Cirrus as one example, I mean, how do we handle all of the Chinese investment that exists in our country already? I mean, they're already here.
Yep, no, for sure. And a lot of those investments have already been mitigated. And Grand Forks, and sticking with Grand Forks for a minute and talking about Cirrus, the Cirrus was purchased by a Chinese company, a decade ago. A decade ago, our attitude toward China was very, very different. We were still hopeful that China could become a good neighbor, could become a good trading partner, could become reliable. But all they did over that course of that 10 years is continue to spy, continue to steal our technology and intellectual property, build up a military that's larger than ours, and in some cases much higher tech, usually technology that they stole from us and improved upon. So we've learned a lot more about China since then. In the meantime, those investments have been, again, mitigated. But what we shouldn't be doing is adding new investments, especially when we know their model, Rob. I mean, having sat through many, many, many of these discussions, both classified and unclassified, at the highest levels as well as the more general levels, there's nobody that does this better than China and the Chinese Communist Party, and there's nobody that has more patience than they have. That's another thing that's different from us and them. And so when they're in your community, when they have people in their community, it is their law that if you're a Chinese citizen and you're asked to spy on your institution or your community or the PTA or whatever, provide notes, take pictures, they do it for the most part, unless they're going to violate their own laws. It's not the fault of good people. There are a lot of good Chinese Americans, good Chinese immigrants. God knows we need them in many institutions. We love them. But we also have to be realistic and go in with our eyes wide open on these things. So again, a lot of this is forward-looking. Is with regard to previous investments. So yeah, we just have to be aware and be smart about how we deal with them.
So let's talk about this balloon over Montana.
Yeah,
And
wow.
I don't want to. I don't want to, like, I don't think we should be hysterical about this thing.
Right.
Balloons are used in SPI. And the only reason I know is I remember reading an article about our use of blimps or blimps or balloons, whatever you want to call them, dirigibles in Afghanistan, actually, because we could float, they could float in the air almost indefinitely. They could cover like 100-mile radius. I mean, they're really, really useful. So, I mean, it's not that unusual a thing, but I mean, it's floating over Montana. And so it seems like when we went through the Fufeng debate, we had a lot of people who were saying, including aiming it at me, somebody like me, who were like, oh, you Red Scare, you China hawks, you're just out. And I'm thinking, I don't think it's Red Scare when we're just reacting rationally to what the Chinese Communist government. So here they're floating a blimp over Montana. I can't imagine China's interest in this part of the world is maybe part of the Minot Air Force Base's mission, right? And which I'm sure is also a mission in Montana, which is we have a lot of our nuclear arsenal buried under the ground in this part of the world. I mean, this is a real thing that's happening, right? I mean, it's not something out of a movie. Nobody's making it up. It's really happening. And while I don't want to overreact to it, on the other hand, we do need to react to it rationally. And I feel like that's a hump we got to get over. And I remember first talking to you about this during the 2018 Senate campaign when everyone we were having a trade war with China, and the only context anybody wanted to talk about China in was soybeans, right? Which don't get me wrong, are important, but we have got to change our thinking about China, and I don't think everybody's there yet.
No, for sure. I mean, where I am now, and I was sitting in the front row when President Trump signed the first round of the trade deal with China, because we love selling food to China because there's 1.5 billion people there, and they like to eat what we make or feed it. And so they are important. They're an important customer. But my position for the last year, at least, has been that I think we should engage in strategic decoupling from China. China has proven to be an adversary, not even a reasonable adversary, an adversary that lies, cheats, steals, and is very large. They want to take over as a matter of their own stated strategy, take over the economy of the world, the military of the world. They have over 400 ships right now in their Navy, and we're down to like 270, something like that.
And what's paying for a lot of that? I mean, what's paying for a lot of that is commerce with the United States, commerce with the world's largest economy. I mean, that's what's making it rich. All those cheap products that we've been buying from China. Not only have we undermined the American workforce by, exporting and going, selling off energy development, selling off manufacturing and everything to China, where, let's face it, they don't treat the environment, they don't treat their workers like we do here in the United States. I mean, we've been not just undermining ourselves, but also, they've been using that relationship, that economic relationship, as a fuel cell for their authoritarianism, and it's got to stop. So, but when you say a decoupling, what does that look like? I mean, how do we do that? Again, when Cirrus in Grand Forks, right, is the micro anecdote, for how do we decouple? I mean, how do we do that?
Well, I think for the first thing, I think you start with investment both ways. As much as some people love foreign investment, I mean, we have some people who think it's better to get $1 million investment from a foreign country than somehow their neighbor. And I don't know what that's about. I think there's a romanticizing of foreign investment sometimes in economic development. I'd rather grow my economy organically, frankly. But that said, I think it starts there because just a few years ago, and as you know, I'm on the banking committee, we passed legislation that required Chinese investment in the Chinese investments that are traded on American stock exchanges requires them to go through the same tax auditing processes as American companies. Up to that point, they didn't have to. They functioned under their own laws, and so Americans are investing in sometimes not even knowing through their 401ks or whatever in Chinese companies, and that money's not as protected. It's not as well regulated, and so we start with things like that. I think now at some point you have to have a buyer beware, laissez-faire sort of attitude too in a free market system. But we always have to remind people that China is not a free market system. They are a very closed system. They are a government-run economy, and so I just think it cuts both ways. The other thing, though, and I think perhaps even the more important thing, Rob, is that we need to bring back more critical supply chain. But here you have the Trump administration and the Democrats is pushing this massive electric vehicle tax credit with an America-only provision. And the first thing they realized was there aren't enough electric cars being made in America to meet their goals, so they apply it to Chinese-made electric vehicles. Now, you're now subsidizing at the cost of $7,500 per vehicle Chinese-made electric vehicles because you're more concerned about, to quote Al Gore, boiling oceans than you are about China. I mean, China's a much more imminent threat, frankly, than boiling oceans. And then you have just this week, not one, but two critical mineral mines, one in Minnesota and one up in Alaska, were shut down by the federal government without even finishing the environmental impact study. They just shut them down. And if we're going to have critical minerals, if we're going to have electric vehicles or solar panels, we should have mining, and they want to embrace the technologies on one hand, but they don't want to embrace.
Well, I think that gets back to the previous point where, again, we can export a lot of that mining. We can export a lot of that manufacturing to China, who can do it cheaper because they don't care that much about the environment, or certainly don't care about as much as we do. And they don't care that much about their workers because they're an authoritarian regime. And so, which brings me to a proposal that you had that I think a lot of people on the right, frankly, found controversial, which was the idea, and I'm forgetting the terminology of it now, but basically it was like taxing carbon at the border, right? Where we're saying, I really like that idea. I really like the idea of going, because it doesn't impact our relationship with Europe or Canada or Mexico, some of these other places that do a pretty good job generally. But it does impact our relationship with places like China that exploit workers and exploit the environment. I really like that because to me, I see it not as a tariff or anything like that. I see it as, listen, we'll do commerce with you if you do it the same way we do. If you treat your workers as human beings, yes, we will do. I mean, I think that approach could really pay dividends here. I think it pays national security dividends, and that it forces, if China's going to trade with us, forces them to act in the ways we were assuming that they would if they engaged in free trade with us. And it also, helps America economically because it puts them on that seems like a win-win-win all the way around and fits in exactly with what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I agree, Rob, and I appreciate you saying that because when I first proposed the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism that would match what they're doing in Europe in the European Union, prior to the European Union finishing theirs, and they've sort of finished it, but they haven't quite implemented it yet. That was exactly my goal. My goal was to not punish American companies or European companies or any company from a like-minded country, because we do more trade sometimes with our adversaries than our allies, but rather to punish the polluters. So if John Kerry really cares about greenhouse gas emissions, then he should be for this. And he's the guy that could be for it, and he still is not. And although I think he's coming that way, other Democrats are, and many more Republicans are coming that way. Some Republicans have the idea that we should do something more like a cap and trade, which of course would punish American workers. I refuse to have to support a domestic price on carbon. However, to my friends on the right who think that this is not a free markets idea, I would just challenge you with this. Because of those values you're talking about, Rob, labor values especially, and environmental values, our companies are already paying that tax. They're already paying the tariff by increased costs to meet very stringent environmental standards, to the point where the United States has lowered carbon emissions more than the next 8 countries added up.
I often accuse our friends on the left when they talk about conservatives, they talk about us like we're anarchists, right? Like we must be against any sort of government intervention at all. Well, we're not. We're not anarchists. We just want prudent government that protects our liberties. But I think sometimes our conservative friends fall for that too, and they think that they also have to be anarchists. They have to be what the left accuses them of being, and that's wrong. We don't have to be anarchists. I think we're all pretty happy with laws against child labor. I think we're all pretty happy with laws that say you can't just work somebody 80 hours a week or 100 hours a week and not pay them overtime and things like that. I think we're all pretty, like we've established these laws. They work pretty well. Our market hasn't cratered. In fact, I think in a lot of ways they've helped. What's wrong with going to other countries and saying, hey, get on our level?
Well, and remember, if we did that, let's just say, and I won't go into the details of carbon border adjustment mechanism with Europe and all that, because we aren't quite there yet. They're a little bit ahead of us, of course. We've got some work to do. But let's just say we find a standard that our companies already meet. Again, given the fact that they already meet very stringent standards, and we apply a carbon fee to polluters. If they're going to sell stuff to us, they have to meet that standard. On the one hand, you might generate some revenue importing if in fact it makes any sense. But more importantly, what you're probably going to do is grow our economies, and we do more trade with our friends rather than our adversaries, and ultimately change the behavior of the adversaries if they want to do business with the largest economy in the world. And when you combine the United States and the European Union together, you're talking about a really big chunk of the economy that you're more likely, if you're China, to try and meet than to try and defeat with low-cost junk. Now, we also, as Americans, Rob, have to make the decision that we're willing to pay a little more for some trinkets and pharmaceuticals and things.
It's going to impact inflation. It's going to impact inflation. I mean, cost of living is going to go up. And that's unavoidable, but unfortunately, I feel like that ship has sailed. Like our choices are either to continue the status quo, which is not tenable, frankly, from a national security perspective and an environmental perspective and everything else, economic perspective, or we have to accept some pain of frankly, paying for our past mistake. Our past mistake being, and I say a mistake, I'm not really pointing the finger. I used to believe, I remember listening to George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, all through Republicans and Democrats, everybody thought if we have free trade with China, capitalism will insinuate itself in, and all they've done is they've just used it. They've used it. They've used us. They're a command economy, and they've taken advantage of us. It's got to stop. Well, Senator, that's all we got time for. I really appreciate you coming on. This is such an interesting topic, and I was listening to NPR this morning. They were talking about the balloon thing, and they were talking about this is just another quiver in the arrow in the quiver of the China hawks, and I'm like, I don't understand how I'm concerned about them spying on our missile fields, and I'm a hawk. They're being hawks, right?
I would just say thank God for the China hawks.
Yeah. All right.
They're what keep NPR viable in a system like ours.
I don't mind listening to NPR. They're pretty good. Some of that. They have they have good book reviews. Senator, thanks for your time. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.